Hi, I'm Lee Bardwell, and this is my Toolkit for System Cell Biology. In this video, which is number 2 in the series, we're going to talk about the first-order chemical reaction. In a first-order chemical reaction, a reactant A is destroyed or converted or exported, etc., at a rate that's proportional to its own concentration. Examples of this could be a transcript being degraded or a protein being degraded or something being used up, and we could use this scheme for that. Transport into or out of a compartment or conversion from one thing to another, we could use this scheme. Dissociation is represented by this scheme where this AB complex breaks up into free A and free B. It's a first order reaction because the rate is determined by a single concentration, either the concentration of A in the first two schemes or the concentration of that AB complex in the third scheme. Here K is a first order rate coefficient. K is not a rate, it's a rate coefficient, and the units of K are inverse time, 1 over time. Here's some other examples of first order reactions, and we should probably call them first order processes because they're not really reactions. But for example, here we have a population of cells, and cells in that population are dividing. And when a cell divides, you have 2 cells. And as we'll see, this process leads to exponential growth. Here's cells differentiating, cell type A differentiating into cell type B. Here's cell death. And in a different type of model, here's infected people recovering from the virus that they are infected with, so that they're now immune. For the first order chemical reaction, we can write down a rate equation, dA dt equals negative Ka. What this is telling us is that the rate at which A changes at any given moment of time, dA dt, is equal to K times the amount of A that's present at that time. So a more accurate way, although a bit more cluttered way to write it, would be as follows. This reminds us that A is actually a function of time. The amount of A is actually a function of time. And it'll be changing as the reaction progresses. So therefore, of course, the rate will be changing. So the rate equation tells us how the rate of change of A varies as a function of time. The rate is going to change over time because the amount of A in the reaction is going to change over time. Note that the rate equation also tells us how the rate of change of A varies as a function of the amount of A, right? Because here's the amount of A at any given time. This rate equation is a differential equation that is ordinary because it has no partial derivatives. It's first order because it has only first derivatives, no second derivatives, etc. And it's linear. These are the same 3 properties that the differential equation for the zero-order chemical reaction had. Another way to write the rate equation is dA dt equals negative Ka to the 1, and again, that's just a reminder that we're talking about a first-order chemical reaction. After some rearrangement, we can integrate each side of this rate equation to obtain the integrated rate equation. And this is another example where we can get an exact symbolic solution as our integrated rate equation. And that solution is A of t, A at any time t, equals A naught e to the negative kt. This is an example of an exponential function, and exponential functions as a class are extremely useful for describing how reactions or events evolve over time. What this is saying is that the amount of A at any time t is equal to the starting amount, A naught, times e raised to the power negative kt. Let's try to dissect that a little bit more. First, let's recall that E is Euler's constant. It's approximately equal to 2.72. To go further, let's examine the behavior of this function at some interesting parameter values. How about we start with at time equals 0. So if t equals 0, then this part here, the negative kt in the exponent, is going to go to 0. It's going to equal 0. Therefore, we just have a naught times e to the 0. But of course, e to the 0 equals 1. And that's not a special thing about e. It's a general property of exponents. Any x raised to the 0 power equals 1. So we have a at time 0 is equal to a0 times 1, or just a0. And that's basically saying that at the start of the reaction, you start out with the starting amount. How about we try another interesting time point? Let's let t go to infinity and see what the right side here looks like. So to do that, it's helpful to remember that e to the negative kt is equal to 1 over e to the kt. Again, this is not anything special about e. It's a general property of exponents. Any x to the negative n can be expressed as 1 over x to the n. Now, e to the kt goes to infinity as t goes to infinity, which means that the whole thing 1 over e to the kt goes to 1 over infinity as t goes to infinity. But 1 over infinity is defined as being equal to 0. And so we simply have a at t equals infinity is equal to a0 times 0, or simply 0. So now we can look at our plot of the integrated rate equation. This is a plot of the amount of A, shown on the y-axis, versus time, shown on the x-axis. It's a classic curve known as an exponential decay curve. When time equals 0, we start with a naught. As time goes to infinity, the amount of A approaches 0. It never ever gets there, but it asymptotes to it. We can interpret the slope of this time course at any moment in time as the rate of the reaction at that moment. Here you can see that the rate is constantly changing. It starts out negative, quite negative, because this is a negatively sloped line, and it becomes less negative as time progresses because the rate is directly proportional to the amount of A, and the amount of A decreases as time progresses. So in other words, the rate is slowing down as time progresses. Before we look at the rate versus amount plot, let's take a moment to remember the quadrants of the Cartesian coordinate system, because I am going to be plotting the rate versus amount in the fourth quadrant. As the amount of A increases, the rate is getting more and more negative. As the amount of A increases, the rate is getting more and more negative. Here's the rate equation. dA dt equals negative Ka. So a plot of rate versus amount is going to be a straight line of slope negative K. In this particular instantiation, we let K equal 1, and therefore what you see plotted is dA dt equals negative A. It's a straight line, linear differential equation. Let's do our unit check now. So the units of a rate are amount per time. Here I'm using micromolar per second. The units of K, as I said, are inverse time. So here inverse seconds. The units of A are, of course, in amount. And so the units balance in the rate equation. In the exact solution, A is an amount, micromolar units. A naught is an amount, micromolar units. This is interesting, e to the negative kt. The units of K are inverse seconds. The units of time are obviously seconds. When you multiply those two together, they cancel out. And then this whole term becomes dimensionless. And hence we have amount equals amount. So the units balance here. And then, of course, A at time equals 0 equals A naught. Let's now talk about the characteristic time, also known as half-time or half-life. This is an important concept in understanding first-order processes. We've seen that some simple exponential functions asymptotically approach a limit as t goes to infinity. Of course, it's going to take forever to get to that limit. The characteristic time is useful because it tells us how long it's going to take to get halfway to that limit, and it's a finite number. In one half-time, from wherever you start, you will get halfway to where you will eventually end up. And for exponential growth, doubling time is a related concept. So let's look at this graph. We start out with 12 units. We know that as time goes to infinity, we're going to asymptotically approach 0 units of A. What we're trying to find is what is the time that we're left with half the amount that we started with. We started with 12, so at what time do we have 6? What is this particular time, tau, where we're left with 6 units of A? So to find that, we're going to solve our integrated rate equation for that particular value tau at which the amount we have at that time is equal to half the amount we started with. With a little algebra, and providing you remember your properties of exponents and logs, you can solve this equation quite easily to get tau equals the log of 2 over k. This is the natural logarithm of 2, which is approximately equal to 0.7. So in this case here, when k equals 1, tau does equal 0.7. Once you have this identity, you can rewrite the integrated rate equation as follows. The amount of A at any time t is equal to the amount you started with, A0, divided by 2 raised to the power t over tau. So, if the amount of time elapsed is 1 increment of tau, then the amount you have is half of what you started with. If the amount of time elapsed is 2 increments of tau, then the amount you have is 1/4 of what you started with, etc. Finally, let's note that the half-life depends only on k. It is independent of A0. Another way of saying this is that the half-life is controlled only by k. In other words, the only parameter that influences the half-life is k. Here we see a graph of an exponential decay curve starting at 20 units, asymptoting down to 0 units as time goes by. Here I've set k to equal the log of 2, and so the half-time tau is 1. So in 1 unit of characteristic time, which happens to be 1 minute, we've gone from 20 to 10. In another minute, we've gone from 10 down to 5. In another minute, we've gone from 5 down to 2.5. As we change k, we can see that that changes the characteristic time. As we change A0, the starting amount, we can see that the characteristic time does not change. Again, characteristic time is independent of A0 and depends only on k. Here's the code in Mathematica that I use to create this manipulatable plot. It's pretty much just a straightforward manipulate of a plot of the exponential function. The most complicated part is this grid lines specification. And that's what allowed me to create these grid lines that track with the characteristic time. Before we go any further, let's try to get a feel for what a first-order decay type process, such as shown here, might look like. So let's imagine that we have 36 balls in a box, and inside each ball there's a little demon that's going to roll a die. Okay, so 36 demons, 36 dice, one inside each ball. And if that demon happens to roll a 6, then that ball is dead. And those demons are going to roll those dice once per second. Hence, in any second, the chance of any single ball dying is 1/6. We start with 36 balls. and we're going to click through this simulation at the rate of 1 per second. So with 36 balls and the chance of any single ball dying being 1/6, we predict that we're going to lose 6 balls during the first second. And that's indeed what happens. Now we're left with 30 balls, still the same internal death rate of 1 out of 6, but the predicted population death rate now is 5 balls per second. And indeed, the next second goes by and 5 more balls have disappeared. Now I'm just going to keep clicking through this at the rate of 1 click per second, and we see the balls disappearing. Again, the internal death rate, the chance of any single ball dying per second, is 1/6, because that demon is in there with his die, rolling it once every second, and if it comes up a 6, that ball is going to blink out. But the population death rate is slowing down dramatically. And eventually all the balls are gone. Here's a mathematical prediction of what the results of that experiment should have looked like. Starting from 36 balls, we should have had an exponential decay approaching 0 balls as time goes to infinity. Here's what the actual results of the simulation were, plotted on top of that curve. Now, of course, in this simulation, I didn't actually roll any dice, and there weren't actually any demons inside those balls rolling dice. Rather, the expected number of balls were removed at the expected time. If I had actually rolled dice, the resulting data would have been more noisy, but if I'd repeated that experiment enough times and averaged everything out, I would get something that looked like this. This simulation, which comes from iwanttostudy.org, is stochastic. So we have 36 balls, probability of a ball disappearing is 1/6, and I will click through it. You can see that on the right is being plotted the disappearance of the red balls as well as the appearance of the empty gray spaces. And we can even compare the actual results to the predictions from an exponential decay curve. Okay, pretty good, but not perfect. With more balls, we should get a better fit to the mathematical prediction. Better, still not perfect. Remember our first order conversion reaction. A is converted into B. We could think of this as red balls being converted into gray balls. So if we have 100 red balls at the start and we let the reaction proceed, we can monitor the disappearance of the red balls on this curve and the corresponding appearance of the gray balls on this curve. Now, if the equation of the red balls disappearing is given by red of t equals r naught times e to the negative kt, and in this case r naught is 100, then the equation that describes the appearance of the gray balls is simply gray of t equals r naught times the quantity 1 minus e to the negative kt. That's how you describe taking this exponential and flipping it. So now we have exponential approach rather than exponential decay. Before we wrap up, I want to spend a couple minutes on exponential growth. In exponential growth, as in cell division or other population growth processes, the rate of change of A is proportional to positive K times A. And the exact solution is that A at any time t is given by the amount you started with times e to the positive kt power. Another way of writing this is that A of t equals the amount you started with times 2 to the power of t divided by dt, where dt stands for doubling time. It's equal to the log of 2 over k, and it's an analogous concept to the half time in exponential decay. So in this example, we start with 5 cells at time 0, and the doubling time is 10. After one doubling, we have 10 cells. After 2 doublings, we have 20 cells. After 3 doublings, we have 40 cells, and after 4 doublings, we have 80 cells. Furthermore, after 10 doublings, we've gone from 5 cells to over 5,000 cells. The rate versus amount plot for exponential growth is just a straight line, positively sloped, of slope k. Notice that in an exponential growth process, the amount of A is going to be increasing, so therefore the rate is also going to be increasing as the process proceeds. So, to summarize, we've been talking about first-order processes, such as decay, degradation, or depletion of A, the conversion of A to B, or the transport of A into a different compartment, or a cell division process where A divides to become 2 cells. And in these first-order processes, the rate of change of A is proportional to the amount of A present.